Annet, Dr. Annet, should I give it a few more minutes? I think our attendees are still joining in.
Yes.
About 3 to 4. Yeah, I can see they're still streaming in. Yeah.
Okay. Do you
Great.
see how many people we have? Okay, participants. Okay.
So far we have 4. I should send a reminder right now, but I had sent one in the morning.
Okay.
Great. Oh, great. I think to respect everyone's time, I propose that we begin, but the reminder has gone through already. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. We are glad to have you today for this session. Maybe if I could start with giving you an agenda of the day. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about who NIERA is, and then I'll invite our speaker for the day, who is Dr. Annet Adong. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session, and then we'll close the session for today. And even before I begin with the introduction, I could give you a few housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A session, or you can actually chat in the chat box as well. And we will be recording this session and share the recordings for the session as well. Right. Fantastic. So thank you once again. My name is Anne Maina. I work with the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa as a program assistant. And we are glad to have you today as well. So NIERA, in brief, NIERA is an independent network of East African scholars who conduct decision-focused evaluations for social and economic development programs in East Africa. Our members are spread out across the 5 East African countries, that is Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. So currently we have a membership of 37 members whose expertise cut across different sectors, that is health, agribusiness, financial inclusion, etc., etc. And so NIERA's work is anchored on 3 pillars, that is capacity building, evidence generation, and policy outreach. And in terms of capacity building, we have been conducting impact evaluation trainings for different audiences across East Africa, which have been held before on Zoom and have been conducted by our members as well. So on evidence generation, we purpose to conduct impact evaluation studies across different sectors, which is also tied to our 3rd pillar, which is policy outreach, which our main goal is to influence policy making from the evidence that we derive. So, and we are currently hosted at the United States International University that is here in Nairobi, Kenya. So in brief, that's it about NIERA. And for this session, our member today, who is Dr. Annet Adong, and who is also with Makerere University, is going to present key findings of a systematic review and meta-analysis study that he has conducted over the last couple of months, and which also taps into our evidence generation activities. So with that brief introduction, allow me to introduce Dr. Annet Adong, take us through the session and give us more insights on her studies. So thank you very much. Dr. Annet Adong, are you there?
Thank you so much, Anne. I can share my screen now.
Sure.
Okay.
Maybe as you do that, I could request that for attendees to actually indicate their actual names, so that as we finish up this session, we can share with you the recordings and the materials as well. So key in your exact name as it had appeared on the registration link. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Anne. My name is Annet Adong, as Anne has already introduced, from Makerere University, but also a member of the Network for Impact Evaluators in Africa. So today, my presentation is on do adaptation strategies to climate change impact on food and nutrition security in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a systematic review that was done by myself and two other colleagues, Julia Chola and Caroline Otike. So climate change remains a threat to So climate change remains a threat to climate change. The climate change through, for example, increasing mean temperatures, reduced rainfall, variability of both rainfall and temperatures over the years, threaten the agricultural sector, but also it causes aspects of water shortages, leading to shorter growing periods in some areas. There's also been increased magnitude and frequency of flooding and droughts, and changes in plants and animal disease and pest distribution patterns. So these are aspects of climate change that have been that have revealed themselves over the years, and this has led to a significant threat to Sub-Saharan Africa. Where most of the economies depend on agriculture. As you all might be aware, but most of the countries in the Sub-Saharan Africa have their economies dependent in agriculture as a source of employment, but also as a source of raw materials. So climate change threatens the food production, the human health, and the environmental conservation and water availability. So what has been done so far? So the concept of climate smart agriculture has taken stage in the policy cycles, having been conceived by the Food and Agriculture Organization of FAO, that's in 2010. And mainly it covers climate smart agriculture, covers mainly various interventions, ranging from outcome related, agronomic and economic productivity, resilience, adaptive capacity, and mitigation outcomes. So resilience and adaptive capacities are the concepts are mainly related to the ability of households to bounce back to their previous levels of production, nutrition, and food security, and in that way to minimize any vulnerability that might be caused by climate change. So within the concepts of climate agriculture, we have aspects of of ensuring that households become resilient, that is, they're able to bounce back to their previous levels of production once they are exposed to climate change threats. So examples of interventions that can help households to be resilient, but also increase their adaptive capacity, include water harvesting interventions, stress tolerant seed varieties, new risk-oriented savings, credit products, index insurance, risk management, and so many others, which I'll talk about as we move along. So the policy framework to support the adaptive responses of adaptive responses to climate change within Sub-Saharan Africa have also taken center stage. So we know that the African Union and the NEPAD, CADIP, launched the Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture in 2015. So this was mainly to scale up climate smart agricultural practices, which are already highlighted, include both agronomic practices, but also economic and non-economic practices. So subsequently, many African countries have made efforts to incorporate aspects of climate change and also specifically also aspects of climate smart agriculture into their national agricultural, food and nutrition security investment plans, or broadly their agricultural policies. So for example, Uganda's agricultural sectoral development plan focuses on the generation and upscaling of climate change resilient technologies. So for examples include, promoting pests and drought resistant varieties, water harvesting technologies, and index-based weather insurance. So these are just some of the climate change resilient technologies that are cited in Uganda's agricultural sector development plan. Then as for the case of Kenya, Kenya's climate smart agriculture aims at enhancing smallholder farmers' adaptive capacity and resilience to climate change through education and creating awareness about, awareness and, risk assessments. Then Tanzania's agricultural climate resilience plan aims to achieve adaptive capacity by accelerating the uptake of climate smart agriculture and also strengthening the knowledge of farmers. So Ethiopia also has also incorporated aspects of climate resilience into their plan, into their, I think the term it is, so the term it is the Ethiopia's climate resilient economic strategy. So it seeks to reduce the vulnerability to the impacts caused by climate change by building the resilience of the citizens and their adaptive capacity. So ideally, through all these frameworks and policies, aspects of building adaptive capacity, but also resilience of resilience of smallholder farmers comes up in the respective programs. So for this study, just back to the study now, for this study, the rationale is that we know that, there are several interventions that have been, that have taken place that are nutrition sensitive, especially, for women and girls, but also, but these interventions are not necessarily nutrition sensitive. So various interventions to increase resilience and adaptive capacity of smallholder farmers might already be taking place in the respective countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, but the extent to which they affect the food and nutrition security of smallholder farmers, and in particular women and children, is might not be taken care of. So in this systematic review, we aim at shedding more light on the existing evidence and gaps in research in regards to, the adaptive strategies and how they might affect food and nutrition security. So we propose to appraise the existing evidence on the effect of adaptive strategies, responses to climate change on food and nutrition security, with a primary objective of looking at what is the available evidence on the effect of adaptive strategies on food and nutrition security in Sub-Saharan Africa, and then what are the available pathways through which these adaptation strategies to climate change impacts on the food and nutrition security. So our findings are relevant. So our findings are relevant to respective ministries of agriculture in the national planning authorities, research organizations, but also international humanitarian organizations. So conceptually, how we conceptualize the study, we know that smallholder farmers' adaptive capacity can be achieved by strengthening their diversity in incomes, but also crop and livestock diversity, rebuilding local institutions and traditional support networks, reinforcing local knowledge and building the abilities of the households to adapt and reorganize. So interventions that enhance diversity, for example, will include conservation diversity, livelihood diversity, and this will minimize the likelihood of households losing all their outputs and exposure to climate change risks. But also interventions that rebuild local institutions and support networks, such as cooperative action. And in this case, I mean, like farmer groups or women groups, will increase the resilience and adaptive capacity because they allow for information sharing, access to resources, for example, credit, and offer opportunities, for peer learning. Then other interventions that improve access to vital agricultural assets, appropriate information, labor and energy saving technologies help also to improve on households' adaptive capacity. And this ultimately will affect will have impacts on food and nutrition security through, for example, increasing the availability of nutritious food, but also increasing the income for farmers to purchase the nutritious foods. And then ultimately, of course, then this leads to improved food and nutrition security. So our scope of the systematic review. So here, just 1 minute. So here our scope, so we looked at articles that are mainly from peer-reviewed studies, which are related to adaptive strategies to climate change and food and nutrition security. And in this peer-reviewed work, we looked at studies that are using only quantitative and mixed method articles. So for example, we use methods such as experimental approaches, non-experimental matching approaches, regression-based, so instrumental variable approach. And but ideally they should be either quantitative or mixed methods. So we didn't look at qualitative studies. Then the study design, the design had to either be experimental design, non-experimental matching design, or regression-based approaches, including instrumental variable approach. So also the studies should use primary and secondary data, but not relying on literature review studies that were solemnly literature reviews, or that were either only systematic reviews or meta-analysis done were not included. Studies were also taken at farm, studies only focused, I think, smallholder farmers. We'll look more into that in the next. So we use a PICO criteria where the population were smallholder farmers from Sub-Saharan Africa. So a number of interventions that lead to that increase adaptive capacity of households were considered. And amongst these include, irrigation, water harvesting, drought-tolerant crops, weather insurance, and improved storage. So our outcome of interest was mainly the food security and nutrition security. And then to measure food security, we looked at measures such as, calorie availability, calorie intake, food availability, food stability, and per adult equivalent nutrient uptake. I think intake, I'll talk more about this. Then in regards to nutrition security outcomes, we looked at aspects of stunting, wasting, hemoglobin, dietary diversity, food utilization, malnutrition generally, body mass index, and calorie and protein availability. So I think this table just summarizes our inclusion and exclusion criteria, which I have already highlighted. So the interventions were those that aim at adaptive, increasing the adaptive capacity of households. And then the outcomes should be only on food security and nutrition security. Then the studies should be those that looked at countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Then the design and primary data, as I've explained, And then, of course, the study area could be the farm or the field. So importantly, we only included studies with strategies that directly intended to mitigate climate change. For example, you know, it was a little bit quite, broad. It's broad. It was a broad study until we kind of tried to limit. We tried to limit the people, the study scope. So here we emphasize studies that only mention, you know, adaptive strategy or climate change. So there are some studies that, for example, we will have an intervention that actually increases the adaptive capacity or strategy of a smallholder farmer, but then they don't make reference to climate change at any one point. So such studies were excluded. So of course, this comes, of course, with limitations. So for example, because we only look at peer-reviewed studies, then that means we exclude studies from grey literature. And of course, there have been arguments in systematic reviews that to a great extent, unpublished studies should also be included in reviews. But also we know that these ideally are a source of bias, and sometimes bias in that, you know, researchers could or people conducting systematic reviews could decide on which studies to include under unpublished, and unpublished studies that can be located are likely to be unrepresentative sample of all unpublished studies. Yeah, it's very unlikely that you will be able to reach out to all unpublished studies. So for example, in such a study that is looking at several countries in Sub Saharan Africa, as a researcher, it would be easy for me, because I come from Uganda, it would be easy for me to identify unpublished studies that are in Uganda, but in the case of other countries within Sub-Saharan Africa, it might not be very comprehensive. So that's the limitation of not using, or limitation of using unpublished studies. But of course, aspects of scientific quality, because, you know, they haven't been peer reviewed, also then comes up. So our results, so this is a flow diagram of, you know, included studies, first the studies that were identified. So our search strategy was from three sources. So we use the Web of Science, we use the Google Scholar, and then we use the Scopus. So from these search sources, we were able to come up with about 15,554 records. But on removing duplicates, I think it should have been the other way around. So first, sorry about that. So first, first we identified about 15,920 records. But then on removing duplicates, we had about 15,544 studies. So these studies were then screened on title and abstracts, and based on our selection criteria, we excluded 14,934. So ideally, these studies, perhaps maybe their outcomes were not specific to food and nutrition security, or yeah. I think majority of the studies actually only stop at identifying the adaptive strategies, the adaptation strategies, and then don't go ahead to look at the outcomes. That's the food and nutrition security in this case. So out of the 15,554, we're then able to screen. We are then only able to, eligible studies were 620, which we screened on full articles, and excluded them. And here we excluded 235 studies based on study design, 291 based on, you know, they didn't meet the outcome criteria. And then 20 were again duplicates. We excluded another 9 studies because the target group were not of interest, that's Sub-Saharan Africa. And then 3 were excluded on publication type, and another 9 excluded based on the region where they were centered. So we ended up with about 53 studies that were included in our systematic review. So here, some of the adaptation, sorry, it should be adaptation strategies, not adaptive strategies. So some of the adaptation strategies that were identified from our 53 studies. So majority, that's about 20 of them, had the adaptation strategies of insurance, farm and finance management. So these are studies that mention that that look at, for example, agriculture insurance, weather insurance, that's rainfall or index-based, livestock insurance, crop insurance, improved storage, microfinancing, income diversification, and labor diversification. So any of these studies, those were about 20 of them. So 8 studies looked at crop management adaptation strategies. So these included, amongst other things, growing of drought-resistant crops or improved crop varieties that are resistant to maybe drought or wind or pests and diseases. So we had about 2 studies under soil management. These are adaptation strategies that focus on soil management. Then we had about 12 studies on irrigation and water management. And then 7 studies on assistance programs. So assistance programs here include, safety nets or social protection, the cash grants, the cash transfers, the aid, the subsidies, and the in-kind transfers. So again, here I must mention that these are studies that make mention of climate change or make mention of climate change So any aspect on climate change, let it be drought or maybe weather variability. So these are then the studies that are included. Of course, ideally, we have various studies that focus on assistance programs or social safety nets, but these do not make, most of them did not make clear reference to climate change or to our outcome of interest. And then social activities, these are mainly social groupings, like farmer groups or cooperative unions. So we had about 4 studies. So via methods, so we looked at, as I said before, we looked at 3 methods, or let's say study designs. So 28 of our studies were regression-based approaches, including, or used an instrumental variable approach. And then 15 of our studies were non-experimental matching. So these are mainly studies that relied on matching methods for estimating impact. And then only 8 studies were experimental in design. And we think that was our main point, where we think the gap in research lies. So only 8 studies looked at the experimental designs, and 2 studies were simulations. So, so the quality, we also assessed the quality of the studies that we selected. So we characterize the study as being of high quality if they exhibited any of the following characteristics. For example, first, if they scored highly on the study design. So ideally here, a study design that is clear on the control group or the counterfactual group was definitely rated highly. Most of the experimental studies, most of the studies that use randomized control trials or natural experiments were rated very highly. And then 2, if they do make mention and present attrition or losses to follow up, which are within acceptable levels, then we consider them. And then the 3rd one is if the outcome was clearly defined, and here our outcome of interest is food and nutrition security. If they were clearly defined and reliable, then also the 4th one is, of course, if there was a balance, the baseline balance on the treated and the control group. Or if there was an imbalance, then it was only within, 5 or fewer variables. So that was our criteria for assessing the quality of the studies. So from the studies that we identified, only 36 met, 36 were of low quality, medium quality were 10, and only 7 were of high quality. And then, so those are the results of the systematic review. And here, in the next slide, I give one of the case studies that was rated highly, but also in terms of quality, but also makes a considerable contribution to the topic. So this was a study by Jason, Barrett, and Moody, which was in the Journal of Development Economics. So here the study looked at the index insurance and the cash transfers, a cooperative analysis from Northern Kenya. So both methods, so both interventions, that's the hunger safety net program and the index-based livestock insurance, both interventions were aimed at helping farmers, especially livestock farmers, in overcoming the vulnerability that is caused by climate change. So the research investigates what, if any, impacts does index-based livestock insurance coverage and hunger safety net program have on the behaviors, but also the food consumption of pastoralic households. So here, this case study, the hunger safety net program is a government-run program. So it provides regular cash to the beneficiaries who are typically very vulnerable. And then in this way, they guarantee them a minimum level of stable income. So here they use a very known criteria of targeting. I think this is in Kenya. And then of course, the regular payments help to maintain some basic levels of consumption and reduce the detrimental risk mitigation strategies. And then, of course, it helps farmers not to rely on destructive short-term coping mechanism. So, usually because when there's a climate, when there's a drought, or there's a flooding, or there's something, farmers or small-scale farmers will resort to, short-term coping mechanism, maybe like selling off their assets in order to survive the threat. So on the other hand, the index-based livestock insurance is privately written. So here clients receive indemnity payments or compensation for any catastrophic loss of livestock, which is a main asset of the region of the study. So here, importantly to the design is that they used a randomized inducement to purchase the index-based livestock insurance. So both methods, so insurance protects against weather-related risk, which is of course a driver of poverty in these areas. So the setting was in the semi-arid region of Marsabit in northern Kenya. So I think with the hunger safety net program, I think I've described it, about 69,000 households were benefiting in the areas of Marsabit, Mandera, Turkana, and Wajir. So we started about 2009 and ended about 2013. So initial households received about 2,550 Kenyan shillings. And then the payments were planned in 8 batches. So in about 200 of the 434 total locations. So whereas the index-based livestock insurance, this the index has developed. So there was a level benchmark for which somebody was eligible to receive the indemnity payments. So this was developed by a team of researchers from Cornell University and University of California, Davis, and the institute, the Livestock Research Institute. So the methods for this study that was employed in this study, so they used 4 rounds of panel data of about 924 households. So attrition was of course indicated to be about 4%, which they thought was somehow non-random. So I think they tried to overcome this methodology, this non-randomness in attrition by reweighing their observations using an inverse weighting procedure. So I think so to estimate the impact of these two interventions on food consumption and other outcomes, they take into consideration that the fact that participation in the hunger safety net program might not have been random, so it may be perhaps non-random. So they employ the instrumental variable approach to identify the local average treatment effect. Then the instrument was they use the eligibility criteria of the households, and then they multiply by the exogenous transfer amounts. Then to estimate the impact of the index-based livestock insurance, they use the exogenous variation in the purchases that was associated with receiving, the coupon. And of course, they provide balance tests. I think that's why we rated it highly. And yes. So now the findings from that study show that the index-based livestock insurance increases investments in livestock health services, reduces asset loss through livestock mortality, and increases milk productivity of the livestock. But importantly, and which is important to this study for the outcome, it showed that it led to improved welfare measured by the income per adult equivalent. So, and also led to improved consumption expenditures by the household. Then for the hunger safety net program also, I think the evidence showed that actually it had a positive impact on child health. And they measured child health by the mid-upper arm circumference, which was, the middle upper arm circumference for the child. So that was how they measured their health. But also they looked at consumption expenditure, and so that, it led to improved consumption expenditure by the households. But one key result that they found that, beneficiaries of both programs, there was no strong evidence of positive synergies from both programs. For people who benefited from both, there was actually no impacts. Then also importantly, they found that the IBL was the estimated impact per unit of the public costs for the two programs was very similar, but the index-based livestock insurance produced far greater benefits in respect to the marginal costs of the additional program, mainly because most of the costs were public costs and they were fixed, unlike the hunger safety net program. So of course, this study relies heavily, especially the case study relies on the authors that I've cited. And I would like to acknowledge NIRA for the funding and also for the researchers that were included in this study. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Annet, for that. Maybe if you can allow me to jump onto the Q&A session.
Okay.
And I ask, I invite the attendees as well to post their questions. So I think we have a question from Julius Atieno, and his question is, did you get any RCTs on adaptation strategies in climate change, impact on food and nutrition security in Africa? Should I go one by one, or would you address them as a go?
I think I can take two.
Great. And I think still from, okay, we have another question from Harriet Owala. Oh no, not Harriet, sorry, still from Julius. He asks, who used the adaptive strategy most? Is it women or men? We know women are adversely affected by climate change, and it would be good if we know whether they take part in the mitigation measures according to the studies just analyzed. And still on the same, maybe if I could read out the third one.
Wow,
Should I pause? Okay, sure.
The two, yeah, lest I'll forget. I think the first one is if there are any randomized control trials in any of the adaptive strategies. Yeah, so I was just looking at the results. So we have, we had 5 studies using randomized control trials, and I think 7 studies. Yeah, 8 studies where we got 8 studies using randomized control trials. But then the adaptive strategies that they focused on, for example, one that I looked at again, a cash transfer program that was linked to weather shocks. I think that was and then another I think looked at the other looked at groups in how they're linked to coping to aspects of climate change. So those are just about 2 out of 7 studies that use RCTs. But most of our studies were regression-based, instrumental variable approach, or even matching. I think matching is a common method. Yeah. And then the second question, and please come again with this again. I think I missed it.
Great. So Julius, still from Julius, he asked, were the studies either rural or urban based? The setup would give us the real picture in either rural or urban areas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julius. I think also that was our criteria, but we looked at both rural and urban studies, and I think out of the 51, we had 49 studies, mainly being rural, and then the others being a mixture of both rural and urban.
Great. And you can raise your hand as well if you have a question. There's a raise your hand at the bottom there if you have a question for Dr. Adong. Still from Julius, he's asked on who used the adaptive strategies most? Is it women or men? And he goes on to say, we know women are adversely affected by climate change, and it would be good if we know whether they take part in mitigation measures according to the studies you analyzed.
That's a very good question, and unfortunately, we didn't really we didn't set a criteria on whether it was women or not, but I know we tried to look out in the studies if it. No, let me retrieve that statement. So in our criteria, we looked at whether the studies were focused on only women, or if they focused on both women and men, or only focused on men. So yes, a few of the studies, I don't quite remember the exact number, did focus on only women. But on whether the adaptive strategies were directed to women, that's also something that maybe we didn't look at, but it sounds interesting. What I can do with the co-authors, we can review the studies and see the extent to which women were directly focused by the interventions. Thank you.
Great. We have still another question from Julius. He asked, what would you say is a gold standard in adaptation strategies to climate change impacts on food and nutrition security studies?
The gold standard?
Yes. What would you say is the gold standard in adaptation strategies to climate change impacts on food and nutrition studies?
Yeah, I think it would be hard for me to just narrow down to one adaptation strategy and say maybe this is a perfect one. Usually a mixture of 1 or 2, the synergies between 1 or 2 studies might produce a better impact than only taking one. So for example, even like livestock insurance, okay, that's for livestock, let's say index insurance that is against rainfall. If it's mixed maybe with the social, maybe a farmer group participation, where farmers can be able to access credits in case of a drought, if a drought happened, and then a farmer can ideally access credits, and with that credit they can purchase 1 or 2 things then that helps. So a mixture of 1 or 2 adaptation strategies could actually help mitigate effects of vulnerabilities of climate change to food insecurity than only using one approach. Thank you.
Great. We have another question from Julius as well. So he asked, which of the adaptation strategies you mentioned looked more sustainable?
That's a very good question, and maybe that's also something that we didn't explicitly look at, which we should include in the report. So sustainability is very important. I think ideally from studies, yeah, of course, if maybe the last case study that I showcased. So for example, we saw that, the hunger social safety net program was, was not cost effective, yeah, compared to the index-based insurance. Why? Because this involved, actual transfers of money, yeah. It involved, cash transfers to households, so it was very costly compared to the index-based insurance, where farmers were actually made to purchase that the index, the insurance themselves. So of the two, based on cost effectiveness, then the index insurance was more cost effective than the actual transfers to households. So yes, we can cite out which are the most sustainable adaptation strategies and which ones are not sustainable. I think another example that I can give, social groups, participation in farmer groups or women groups could be very sustainable than actual, transfers to households. Yes.
Right. We have a question from Dennis Chalo, and he's asking, did you get some adaptive strategies around marine economy, stroke fishing and food security? And if yes, what was the reported key outcome? And second, was the impact on food security significant?
Yes, truthfully, we didn't find any study that was very specific to the marine economy stroke fishing. There's no specific study on this. Of course, that's a research gap that we can also cite out in our reports. Most of the studies on marine economy and fishing only ended up maybe at looking at the adaptation strategies, or not explicitly looking at the outcome of food security or nutrition security. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question from Kasa. Kasa asked, among the climate change adaptive strategies, which adaptive strategies have higher impact on food security?
Yeah, that's a good question. And unfortunately, we only stopped at the review of the studies. We didn't go beyond the meta-analysis to assess the actual impact of these studies. And ideally, maybe that could also be a limitation of the study. Yeah.
Okay. Please feel free to raise your hand. We will give you the right to speak up if you have any questions. But I can see we have a question from Derek Appel, and he asked, did between ex ante and ex post adaptation strategies, I don't know if I got that correctly, but if yes, which are most common?
Yeah, still, again, that's a good question, whether ex post or, I think it's ex post or ex ante, before and or after. Yeah, I think very good. And I must say we didn't ideally look at whether it's ex ante and ex post, but we can already cite out that cash assistance programs were mainly, and social assistance programs. Still, I think majority, including crop management practices like drought-resistant crops and income diversification. Most of them are ex ante before the actual climate change happens. Yeah, so I think majority would be ex post in this case. Ex ante, I mean, might be those interventions that, maybe related to, responses, and these are mainly undertaken by government. For example, yeah, maybe relocation of people because of a flooding. And again, now what comes to mind is we didn't get any of such studies in the 53 studies that we had. So none of them was actually ex ante. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Great. Keep streaming the questions in. Maybe before I proceed, I could request our attendees, if you are registered by the name 822 9015 and so on, please key in your name so that as we conclude this session, we can share with you the materials and recordings. So it's easy for us to actually trace you in our database. And we have also someone who come in as user and someone who's coming as DESU and HP as well. So please key in your name so that I can have accurate records of who you are and can share the recordings and the materials after this session. So we do have a question from Julius. Was there any study on environmental conservation as adaptation strategies in climate change impact on food and nutrition security in Africa?
I think that's a good question. Most of them, I think, stopped at, we only screened for them. I think we excluded them when it came to full text screening, because most of them stopped at only looking at environmental conservation as an adaptation strategy. But how it relates to food insecurity are not cited. Yeah. But yeah.
Right.
Again, for me, that's an opportunity to include some of these adaptation strategies that have actually been studied, but then whose impacts on food and nutrition security are not reflected in these studies. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we do have a question from Desu. I hope I got your name correctly. And please, Desu, give me your surname for ease of trace as well. So Desu asks, can you share with me those articles related with crop insurance in Sub-Saharan Africa? Oh, Desu line. Great.
Yeah, definitely. I think the study will be near. I think we'll share the findings of the study with the participants.
Yes, we will. I hope we are not closing anyone out. Maybe as we move along, may I mention that we do have more of these sessions coming up. We have a number of systematic reviews that have been conducted by our members. So please keep an eye on our social media platforms. That is for NIERA on Twitter at NIERA_EA. On LinkedIn, we are the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa. And our website as well. I should share the link shortly. But we do have about two, three webinars coming up. And we will have our members presenting key findings on different sectors. You have one coming up on public health, and you have one coming up on involvement of women in leadership. So on a gender lens. So I don't know if you have any more questions for Dr. Adong. Yeah, I think this is where we are at. I'm not sure whether I've closed anyone out though, but thank you very much, Dr. Okay. Oh, Derek asks if the paper is public.
Yeah, I think maybe Anne, you're in a good position, but I would say until maybe it's reviewed and the peer review, then we can.
Yes. Yes, we are hoping to have this published in a journal in the next 1 month or so. It's still under the final stages of being reviewed. So as soon as it's out, we'll definitely share the links to the journals as well with you guys. Fantastic. I think this is where we leave it at. I don't know if I closed anyone out, but thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Annet, for the insightful sessions and for the study as well. Congratulations. I know it has taken you quite a number of months to put this together. So we are totally grateful for that. So we will share the recordings after this and the presentation as well. And once the article is published on the journal, we'll share the links as well for your reference. So thank you very much for attendees for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great.